Okay, remote ham radio. I welcome any contact by anybody. My email address, the easiest one is my call, k6fg@arrl.net. So any questions that you might have afterward or any copies of any information, I'll be happy to forward. And I have helped a number of people get their Icom software up and running. Okay, the overview, what is a remote? Why establish a remote? There are alternatives to doing it yourself. There's a question about what can be controlled remotely. What's the relationship among the various boxes that are in the shack? What type of configuration is of interest? What are the issues and traps? And then I'll follow it up with questions if anyone should have any. Okay, what is a remote? Well, it's a rig controlled from elsewhere. It could be, over the internet, which is what typically most of us think about, or it could be by wires, a rig on the hill above the house, next door neighbor's rig. And then the question you have, do you want public access or do you want to have it privately maintained? I personally don't want to give anybody access to my equipment because it's too easy to do some damage if you don't know what you're doing or if you are operating maliciously. Okay, there's a lot of work in setting it up. So my question is, why do it? Well, first, for travel. And my wife and I, over the years, have traveled a great deal and have operated from many, many locations. We've done a lot of cruising, which in early years was wonderful because the bandwidth was adequate to be able to get to the satellites on the from aboard ship. And I've worked my home station, Woodland Hills, California, in the LA area from many places while on the ocean, on many of the oceans. Okay, many of the times hams in the newer locations can't put up antennas because of antenna restrictions, CC&Rs in their deeds and homeowners associations. And so with those restrictions, maybe the remote is the only way you can really get on the air. And that means using a remote that is away from your own location, either say in your office at a friend's place or some other location that is other than where your house is located. Other antenna restrictions, your wife. And some wives don't see the beauty in having a lot of aluminum and steel in the backyard. So, maybe remote operation from elsewhere is something that will satisfy that need. Emergencies. Now I put emergencies in here because I did a presentation at Aries and I figured if I don't put in emergencies, then people will wonder what's wrong with me. But quite candidly, I don't really see a lot of application for use of a remote, especially at my home location, using my laptop computer during an emergency. In a true emergency, I don't really care about getting on from the home station. There may not be power, there might not be internet, might not be a whole lot of stuff. And typically with emergencies, we want to have localized communication, usually from mobiles, some handhelds, but I just don't see a lot of application for emergency use, even though there are some people who disagree with that view. And I did it for the fun of it. It's really a kick to get on. I can remember one evening I was in Amsterdam and I indicated I was in Amsterdam and I was operating my rig remotely from the LA area. And this guy said, well, I swung my antenna toward Amsterdam and I lost you. And I said, well, swing your antenna toward Southern California because that's what you're working. Think of it as my rig in Los Angeles and think of it that I'm using my rig in Los Angeles by way of a very long microphone cord. And then he, of course, got the message. There's an ARRL publication on remote operating. I think it's worthy of getting if you have any desire to get into remote operation. It's written on a level that is good for the person new to the topic. Okay, there are alternatives to remotely controlling your ham station. One is remote ham radio. It's very expensive. They charge so much a year, depending upon what class of station you want to work. And I mean, as the remote station, and they charge you so much a minute. And I have a real question as to whether or not this is legal. I've talked to some of the people who are involved with it, and they claim they've been cleared. The FCC says it's legal. It's not doing business. I have my own view on the subject, but it's there. I think it's still there. I haven't checked for quite a while. There is a free remote hams, and it was described first in April 2017 QST. It's free, modest stations all over the place. A lot of people have volunteered to put their stations on their network. And at the last time I checked, it wasn't too busy, but I expect it's going to get busier. what are the ethics involved in using a distant community remote? Some people think it's really wrong. Now, I'm on the West Coast. For me to operate on 160 or 6 meters, for instance, to try to work into Europe can be quite a challenge. But if I were to operate through a remote station located, let's say, in Maine, it would count for DXCC because technically I'm still operating within the states, within our entity. The ARRL recently revisited the DXCC rules and affirmed that, saying it's really no different from just driving to Maine and operating your rig in Maine, because you're still operating from the US and it would count. I don't like that. It's the rule, but I don't think it's a good one. I think the FCC or the ARRL ought to revisit that and treat it much like they do the Worked All States Award, by which there is a radius in which you must operate to get credit. How do you connect to the radio? Well, there's the Flex Maestro, and some of these numbers are a little bit old because I have not updated a lot of this information. The Maestro with the Flex radio stuff is, I understand, very good, but it's very pricey. Elecraft has this control head device that last I saw was about $900, and it seemed to work very reliably. In fact, I attended a meeting of the Southern California DX Club one evening, and Eric was there with his control head working his station up in Northern California, and I had my laptop and I was operating my station in Southern California remotely from the club meeting, and it was kind of a kick. There are also devices where there are boxes you can put at both ends, one at the rig, one at your laptop, and they work. And there is new stuff coming out all the time. MFJ has come out with something or they did a couple of years ago, and I understand it works reasonably well. They're rig expert, but all of these devices that make it relatively easy to put together require you, when you're operating in a remote location, to not only your laptop, but to have this other box with you that actually does the work for interconnecting on the internet to run your rig. Now, I'm using Icom, the Icom RSBA1. It's only software, and there are no boxes or anything to carry except the laptop. And it cost $150. It originally came out, their version 1, and they've now upgraded to version 2, which is a little pricier. It used to be $100, now it's $150 or thereabouts. And it works. It takes some getting used to getting it on. It's not all that user-friendly to set up. Okay, do you want to have a computer operating at the rig location? Now, I personally did not, but if you don't mind a computer going, if you can have your computer control your equipment, then as long as you can control it remotely using PC Anywhere, Skype, TeamViewer, or any of the other remote programs, you can do it, and you don't need anything special. However, the way I've done it through using the Icom software, everything is done through the router, especially when we've taken long trips. I didn't want to have a computer going all the time for a couple of reasons. You never know what might happen. I didn't want a failure, and I didn't want anyone to maybe come in on a port and cause some damage. I felt more secure just having a computer turned off completely. Okay, the configuration objectives: no boxes at the remote, only the laptop. No boxes at the home station, no active computer, and full control over the home station, including equipment power on and power off. What's to be controlled? Transceiver, rotator, amplifier, digital programs, anything else you can think of. And there are relatively easy ways of doing a lot of that stuff now, especially if you search around the internet. A lot of Wi-Fi devices that can be controlled remotely from your phone, $20 range, $25 range to turn power on and off, and for any number of functions. I do something here at home on one of those devices to remotely turn on and off the sprinklers, or remotely opening or closing the garage door, that kind of stuff. Okay, here's what the RSBA1 software looks like. It's generic. It doesn't matter what rig you're using, but this is a picture of what it looks like on the laptop. This is the program I use for rotator and stepper control. It's not free. It's 20 euros. It's from a fellow in at YO3DMU. Excellent program. I prefer this program to the programs that are free that are available, and I'll get to that in just a moment. My new Elecraft amplifier has this remote available, and I can see the important things that are going on. I see what the power is, the SWR. I see if there are any faults. I can clear the faults, all that stuff. And it provides for access to whatever I need to do while I'm at the remote location away from the amplifier. Most of you know FL-Digi can operate that remotely. And here's what Marty Wall's True Love, FT8, that is also available over the remote. In the setup, let's look at our normal router environment. In your typical location at home, you've got your internet that goes to a modem, that goes to a router. The router then goes to things like your computers, your printers, whatever. That's your normal setup. However, what if you want to, for instance, control your transceiver or your antenna or your amplifier? You want to do that from the computer? You can do that. Let me see if I can get. Do you guys see the cursor on the screen? Oh, you do. Okay, that will be helpful. You can do that if you can gain access to the computer by the different devices, and then therefore you can control everything through the computer. But let's go another step. What if instead you want to try to control things over the internet, again, going through the modem to the router, and then to go to each of the items in the equipment and not have the computer at all? That can be done. And in fact, that's what I did. This is the block station of what I'm using, the block diagram rather, the remote computer, internet, modem, router, and the various items in the shack. And I'll get to the adapter in a moment. Here is what Icom says is their software, and just a basic flow diagram of what it is. It looks very easy, but it's not. It is a pain in the you-know-what. If it were so easy, why does Icom America on its website have a 44-minute video explaining how to set it up? And then it's not all that terribly clear. And there is another YouTube video in setting up the software. And it's not simple. Okay, the router, there's no computer at the rig's location. The router does all the work, but you've got to configure the router. And here's where I had to figure out a number of things. I had to learn a lot of stuff. I'm using an Asus router, and there were reasons for it, which I'll get to in a moment. There are firewall settings, because you have a firewall in that router, and it wants to keep things out of your router that might be annoying or might cause damage. And one of the things that might be annoying might be some fool, some ham who wants to operate a rig remotely. So you've got to be able to make sure that that passes. In addition, you have stuff coming in and out of the router in ports, and you have to have them go from what it sees coming in over to the particular device that you want to control. That requires some settings in the router for port forwarding. And then there are IP addresses which have to be addressed, and I'll get to that as we go. Here is the port forwarding. I have a lot of things that are a lot of pieces, a lot of peripherals that are connected to the router. I intentionally have obliterated things like the IP addresses, the local ports, and the range, and all that stuff, because I didn't want any mischief to visit me. Okay, a word about IP addresses. Most of you are probably much more familiar with this than I am, but there are local IP addresses, which is what your router uses to connect to your particular piece of equipment. Many of the routers will have it set up such that the local IP address will start out 192.168.1. something, and usually it will assign it automatically for you, or you can define what you want it to be. But that's local. That's the router talking to the equipment in your shack. Then there's external, sometimes called public IP addresses, and that's what the outside world sees to connect to the router. And it does not normally start the 192.168. It has other numbers. And that is how the outside world gets to you, because your router will have that particular address that is assigned to you by your internet service provider. But there are two types of IP addresses. There's something known as a static IP address, which is what it sounds like. It never changes. It stays the same. For most home users, we have dynamic IP addresses. Sometimes, and that means they change, and they change whenever the service provider feels like they want to do it, or maybe when you reboot the router. Sometimes you can have that IP address in there for a year. Sometimes you might only have it in there for 10 minutes, but there's a way of dealing with that. If the IP address is static, you can always use that IP address remotely to get into your router, to get into your rig, to control it. However, if your service provider uses dynamic IP address, which is what most of us use, then you have to fool your router by using what's called a dynamic domain name server, DDNS. And what that does, it's up in the cloud, and you get access to it. And when you try to log on to your rig from the remote location, you go to the address that of your particular account for your DDNS, and then it automatically sends everything to your current dynamic IP address. And it's analogous to having a post office box where it doesn't matter where you live, because you pick up everything that gets sent to the post office. And the routers will typically have some capability to be able to automatically sense when your IP address is changed, and will automatically communicate to the DDNS server what your now new IP address is. And it's all done automatically. You have no idea it's going on. Okay, this is the normal path that we went into a little bit ago: the remote computer, internet, the rig, modem, router, all that stuff. And that is, if you have a static IP address, it works just nifty, no problem. But if the IP address changes, you're stuck. That's why you have to have that DDNS in there to change things. Okay, again, it's a forwarding service in the cloud. From you log on to the DDNS, and it always knows where to send the information. It transparently does that. And some of the DDNS servers are free. The one I use has a free service, but you have to use it every 30 days, or they threaten that they will throw you out. The paid version is about $20 a year, and that's what most of us who use that particular service use. Okay, again, the normal path. And now here is with using a DDNS server. The remote computer goes to the internet. Internet goes to the DDNS server, which in mine, the one I'm using is this one, www.noip.com. It then goes back to the internet and then to my router, and everything works from there. But I literally communicate with the DDNS server, even though I don't know I'm doing that, because you hit an icon and there you are. Alternatives to DDNS servers. Apparently, there is an IP address backup for remote operation, an article, an inexpensive Arduino-based solution. I looked at it for a moment and decided I really don't know Arduino, and I didn't care to learn it at the time, gain familiarity with it, and what I had was working, so why screw with it? Okay, the software on the remote laptop. I've got the Icom radio software, the RSBA1, the Amplifier software, digital programs I've got on there: FLDigi, Digipan, WSJTX, and then the Rotor programs. The N1MM Rotor is free. A lot of people like it. There's an LP Rotor a lot of people like. I like the PST Rotor, AZ Rotor from the fellow, the Y03 fellow, and it works perfectly. Again, there's what the screen looks like on the laptop for the rig. And here's something compatible Icom radios. And you may see that there are a lot of them. If they have a built-in server, such as the 7800, the 7851s, I believe the 7100 has that. They have the ability for remote on and off, where you can turn the rig on and off remotely, which is really slick. And I'm going to get into that in a moment too. Indicated the Icom radios, all communications through the Ethernet, and just a simple patch cord in my setup between the Ethernet port on the radio and the router. Rotor and amplifier. That same fellow who I mentioned, who talked about Arduino alternatives to what I was doing, put an article in January 2014 CQ, remote without a computer in the shack. I didn't understand the article, even though I read it about 3 or 4 times, and it just made no sense to me. And I was able to track him down and call him, and I started asking him some questions, and it turned out he had an Elmer who helped him with that. And Jim confided that his friend is the one who knew all about it, that he really didn't. So he very strongly recommends using cheap devices, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Here is what the rotator and the stepper screen looks like. The amplifier looks like that. That's the icon that I use for it. Okay, the devices I'm using, the rotor, the stepper, push to talk, have to have RS-232 ports, because most of my equipment now is not that recent in vintage and still uses RS-232 and not necessarily USB. But you need an adapter to create a COM port on the router. Literally, these little devices, not that one, that's an expensive one. That is something that let's see, costs $307 at HRO, and it gives you one RS-232 port. You plug it into your router, and then it's not easy to hook up it by virtue of the fact it has a 91-page user's manual. I'm using these devices. They're about the size of a deck of cards. The one on the left has 1 port. The one on the right has 2 ports. One side of it goes to the router. The RS-232 ports are on the other side. These are not inexpensive. They are $160, $190, but you've got to supply then your own software to run the peripherals. Now, I liked those devices because the fellow I talked to, Jim, suggested using super cheap available devices that are available now, because there's a whole lot of stuff out there commercially that wants to see an Ethernet port on one side and then does something electronically inside whatever the peripheral is, but there's no tech support. And it can take forever to figure it out. The tech support for the company that I used was wonderful. They understood their product perfectly. I don't know how many of you have had the experience where you call tech support and you end up being convinced that you know more about their product than they do. Well, it's the other way around with regard to the Moxa devices that I use. Okay, this is again how things work: internet, modem, router, the Ethernet to a COM port, and then the COM port goes to the rotor, the stepper, or whatever else is controlled by RS-232. The interface, I've indicated what it does is it just gives you a virtual COM port. When you set it up, on your laptop, you'll actually, even though you're not doing it every time, just in the setup, you're actually telling the software to go to that COM port that shows on your laptop, but actually what it is, it's showing you the virtual COM port that is on your router that talks to that peripheral, and it's flawless. It works beautifully. And again, don't use the cheap swap meet devices that Jim Tallons recommends, because you'll spend hundreds of hours and never get it to work. The router settings, the adapter settings, those are not all that terribly intuitive, but there are software packages that come along with that particular device, and it made it very easy to get it going. And there's this one Windows Driver Manager program, and I've got more COM ports than the 5 that you see here, but now that is. But it leads you through a way to set it up easily, where the address it's looking for is the peripheral address, the IP address that's internal in the router, the 192.168 stuff. Again, here's what the port forwarding settings look like, and that takes really some doing to figure out how to set it up and why to set it up. And it's something I don't want to go into now because it does get kind of complicated and I'll put everybody to sleep. That is those of you who are still awake. FLDigi looks like this, and the WSJTX looks like that. Now the digital modes, interesting problem here. Those of you who have used FLDigi, Digipan, or whatever, you set it up so that you have to give it the audio path to get to your rig. You also have to tell it how to control a rig. If you're going to use push to talk, that's one thing. The audio going from the laptop over the internet to the rig, the audio from these devices from like FLDigi, that rides right on the Icom software, no problem. But the push to talk is different. The push to talk needs for there to be a port set up for it so that you create a COM port for that, and you use that COM port to turn on either an NPN transistor switch to pull down the push to talk, or I used an opto isolator because I'm paranoid about ground loops, and I figured I just didn't want to create a ground loop unnecessarily. Okay, again, here's the remote rig, the remote computer rather, the internet, modem, router, adapter going here. Now, I have put in here the additional information for use with the digital modes or using FLDigi. The audio goes straight from the router to the rig, but then the push to talk goes through another adapter that goes to the push to talk to turn that on. Okay. I'm having trouble seeing the very top of it, view from the remote laptop. The remote thinks it is directly connected to the home station. Well, actually it is, because it's connected sometimes over an internet path that might be 10,000 miles away, but or long. And it is talking to all these COM ports and the Ethernet ports directly. Okay, what about some of the other issues? The Icom transceiver and the Elecraft amplifier can both go to sleep and wake up remotely with just a very simple command from the software on the laptop. Now, the Rotor and the other home station peripherals, I found the best way to do it was to use one of these smart power strips. They are typically used for entertainment centers for most consumers. And what they do is they have one master socket, and you plug in, let's say, the device that you want to turn on and off. Like, typically, let's say it's the amplifier. If you plug it in there, you turn on the amplifier, this strip senses that current is being drawn, and it then the device, the power strip, turns on the other power sockets. So if the one thing comes on, like in my case, if the Icom transceiver comes on, it'll now be sensed, and all the other power that is needed to control the station peripherals will come on. And I've indicated there the one I suggest, and you can't just use any one of them because some of them are very, very sensitive, and just the keep alive power in the transceiver to enable it to be able to turn on remotely, that power is sufficient, or that current is sufficient to turn everything else on. So you've got to make sure you have one that is adjustable as to its threshold, and set it so that it will sense what you want it to do. Then antenna issues, how do you control those? Well, the stepper is easy, it follows, and you don't have to worry about it. I'm using also for other antennas, like for 160 and 80, I'm using an Ameritron device that automatically switches to the correct antenna dependent upon which band my rig happens to be selected remotely. Privacy issues. How do you connect to the internet? Well, through hotel Wi-Fi. Is that going to be private? Is it not? Can somebody get in there and cause some mischief? Yeah, maybe. What about how do you get to the internet? Hotel Wi-Fi I have found to be very good in most modern cities. Mobile phone hotspot, I've done it from my Android cell phone, and then there are devices put out by the various companies, I believe they're called jetpacks and stuff, and they seem to work fairly well. Miscellaneous issues. What if I lose the internet while in transmit? This particular program, if it does not receive a signal from your remote location. I think it's something like, well, I forget the number of seconds. It's a modest amount of seconds, something like 8 or 10 seconds. It'll shut down the transceiver, so it will not be locked on. There's a latency issue, especially if you're aboard ship. The latency means that it takes a long damn time for the packets to get from your laptop to the rig. Things work very, very slowly, especially aboard ship at sea, where you have inadequate bandwidth to attend to the needs that exist these days. Things you should be mindful of too: the control path as against the audio path. They arrive at different times. So if you throw it into transmit and start talking, the chances are the push to talk is going to hit instantly, but it's going to take just a short time, enough to chop off the first few words of what it is you're trying to transmit. Documentation. Once you get the beast up and working, it's a good idea to have everything documented. As I've done, I carry all of these documents on my laptop as well, and it has saved my rear end a few times. Okay, traps, virus programs. Again, virus programs also, in addition to firewalls, virus programs want to keep you out too. So you've got to make sure you can get through there. The same thing with port access. Those are things from the router or from Windows itself. The IP address issue, which I've discussed. Windows updates, that's something else. I don't know if they still call it. You computer nerds out there probably know, but we used to refer to it as being Terrible Tuesday. And that is when Microsoft would release updates and basically screw up everything. And I had any number of times when there'd be a new update from Windows, and then suddenly my RS-232 adapters wouldn't work, and I had to figure out how to get around that. Okay, again, in what I've talked about, do you want to have hardware only? I mean, software only, or do you want hardware? That will determine which path to go. I prefer software only, so you don't have to carry a bunch of other hardware with you. Let the router do all the work. Then you've got to deal with the setup parameters that can be time consuming, very frustrating. I find that a reasonably active profane vocabulary will help sometimes get these things to work. Anyway, that's about it. I'll be open for any questions, and I think I don't know the best way to do it. I guess maybe I should stop sharing, and then I can turn it over to our host and let the host deal with it.
Okay, yes, that's good. Anybody have any questions, or is there anything in chat that has any questions? It was a good presentation. It was fascinating to be able to do all that stuff.
Well, thank you.
Have to be almost an IT person to be able to figure out how to do it.
Well, there's a lot of learning involved in all of this, and I invite people to make contact with me if there should be some questions. And it's a kick, it really is, and it's like with many things in the hobby, it's fun to be able to accomplish something new. Okay. Marty Wall raised his hand. So what does that mean?
Tom first from Maryland. Tom, do you want to come on and explain your question? W3TDH.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
You're fine.
We've got a hospital, it's not the only one, where the emergency operations center and the room they gave us for a radio room right next door is on the second floor of the administrative wing with the roof just above us. Only problem is the patient care tower is 9 stories high and is attached to this building, and our antenna is down on the roof of story 2 because the commercial vendor that installed it did it that way. So is there a particular approach you might recommend to controlling that equipment sitting in a box up on top of the roof of the 9-story portion over regular Ethernet? I mean, obviously we wouldn't have to carry anything around. So is there an approach you'd recommend for dealing with that, so we could operate from the room they want us in next to their command center, but the radio and the antenna would be up on the roof of the 9-story section where it can actually do some good?
My guess is that you could literally just locate the radio equipment up where you're talking about and then create a remote operation down at the location where they want you to operate. But, I really question whether there might be easier ways to do that, just with, control cables and stuff.
Well,
Or another thing, if you had a computer up there at the rig up on that 9th floor, you could and you use that rig to control things. Why couldn't you just do it very simply with using like TeamViewer or one of those PC Anywheres or one of those programs?
well, about that last, I don't know, but I'm an electrician by craft, now retired, and I can tell you there's no hope on God's green earth of getting permission and access to run control cables up through the exclusive domain of members of the Communications Workers of America in the telephone closets. And that's the only way for local voltage wiring to make it up to the 9th floor.
Okay, well, the answer to your question is yes, you could do that and just, stick the rig upstairs and operate from a computer or laptop down at the place where you're supposed to be.
Is there a set of equipment, or would you recommend the same approach you're using from like all over the world for your equipment? Or is there a set of equipment that we could get that might make it simpler to do it for a variety of operators, particularly at the hospital?
Well, again, depending upon what you want to control, the box-to-box device might really be the easier way to do it, because you don't care if you have the rig. Well, first of all, what is the rig?
The rig is a Kenwood TH710G. Well, that's the dual band APRS specially enabled radio that Kenwood puts out for VHF, UHF.
I have no idea. I have no idea.
And then the other one is an Icom 7100.
Okay, well, the 7100 can be remoted with the Icom software.
Yeah, I'd seen that from your presentation. I just wondered, if you had any suggestion about the Kenwood.
I don't know about the Kenwood. It may not be remotable. Does it have a separate control head?
Yes, sir, it does.
Well, if it has a detachable control head, there are devices out there that are available where, you can't run a wire. Well, you don't need to. It has 2 boxes. And what you do, one box plugs into the radio part, the other box down at the operation where you'd be operating from plugs into the control head, and it goes out over the internet.
And if you remember off the top of your head, what's the range of pricing on the 2-box set?
I think it's around $400 or $500. Do you have internet access up on the 9th floor?
Yes, that is doable because you're not passing through multiple floors.
Okay, going box to box on the UHF, VHF would probably be the simplest way. And then for the other, I don't know that, I don't know what to recommend.
Thank you. W3TDH.
Thank you. Okay, Marty?
Yeah, good evening. Mark, thank you. Great presentation. And by the way, the hospital issue he mentions is probably a fairly common one because the codes, building codes for hospitals are much stricter than they are for most other buildings, in terms of drilling holes, not drilling holes, all that sort of thing. So I understand his problem. Mark, I was just wondering, if you can think of one, what was the most unusual circumstance you found yourself in when you were doing a remote operation? Just, the weirdest thing, if you will.
Well, I had one situation. Our local radio club has a Wednesday night 10-meter net, and the net control happened to be located not too far from my station, maybe 10 or 15 miles away in the town of Northridge. And one of the guys trying to check in was shrouded by some hills. He lived in Sylmar, and net control couldn't hear him. But I live up a hill a little bit, and we were aboard ship in the Indian Ocean, and I checked in, or I didn't check in, I was listening to the net, and I realized they couldn't hear Bob, but I heard everybody from shipboard. And when net control took a quick break, I jumped in. And I said, "This is K6FG operating remotely from the Indian Ocean, and Bob," and I gave his call, "is trying to check in, and I don't think Net Control hears him." And they were able then to make the contact, and they thought that was incredible. Here I am on the other side of the world, telling Net Control that someone who's 10 miles away from him can't be heard.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Rick Brown, and then for RB, you have a question.
Yeah, on Mark, I appreciate the program and stuff. I do have a 7100, IC 7100 running the software, but I'm under the impression that the RSBA1, and I've version 1, I'm not running version 2, has to have a server at the radio. So there has to be a PC there. And your comments about not having a PC at the radio, I'm wondering how you're doing that to get the 7100 connected to just a router when there's no router connection on it. Can you explain that to me?
In a word, no. What I'm using is a 7800, and it, with the firmware version 3 or greater, has a server built in. I don't know how it's done with a 7100, but if you're looking at connecting it without having to use a computer, a couple of things. Maybe you could use one of the little Arduino devices for that limited purpose and not have to worry about all the other computer stuff. Or in the alternative, you might even do a Google search on RSBA1 and 7100, IC 7100. Maybe somebody has figured out a way of doing it.
Okay, but I also have the 7610, but from what I understand, it's got the built-in server inside of it, but that requires the version 2 of the RSBA1 software. And so I didn't know the RSBA1 software could actually communicate with the radios with the internal server.
Yes, I did use version 1 for a number of years, and then I switched to version 2, and I can't remember the reason I did it, but I did it. Version 2 is easier to install than version 1. Many of the initial steps are far, far more intuitive. Version 1 was just a nightmare, and I can put a lot of adjectives ahead of nightmare.
Okay, thank you. That was what I was wanting to understand, because in my application where I was following along with you, but I was differentiating at a certain time. I'm like, I can't do that. But thanks. I'll give me something else to look at.
Okay. Diana from Nevada wants to know if you can run WinLink Vara HF from your laptop on your home station.
I don't know. I haven't really played around with WinLink, whether I've operated from my home station or remotely. I just haven't done it.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, there's got to be some questions. My biggest remote radio story was from the fire service. The Boston Fire and Houston Fire shared 3354 megahertz for a radio channel. They had a 2-alarm fire in Boston. The propagation was such that the local radio dispatcher couldn't talk to the fire units in the city, but Houston heard them loud and clear. So the Houston Fire Department ran the fire in Boston, which was very interesting because at the time the radio propagation was so strange. So it happens on ham radio too. So that's how when you could hear the guy from the Indian Ocean and the locals couldn't. Had to have been something to do with the atmospheric propagation.
It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that my remote station was located in the San Fernando Valley with elevation. So my station at home heard everybody. But I was working my rig remotely while I was in the Indian Ocean. I had another interesting thing as well. Many of you probably know, if you're into DXing, on a very active station in the Mediterranean, SV9CVY. I heard him on 20 meters from my home station in Southern California while I was operating remotely, about, I think, 300 miles away from his location. And I worked him. And then I explained to him I was working him from California, even though I was on board ship a few hundred miles away from where he was. And he couldn't believe it. He thought that was just incredible.
Yeah, some of this is absolutely fascinating. You can do it. It really is. And once you can figure out the IP and the port forwarding and all of that, it's not too hard if you understand that part of it.
Well, I understood it when I put it all together some years ago. I'm not sure if I still remember, even though I've got a whole lot of documentation as to what I did. But I encourage everyone, if they're going to undertake something like this, use good engineering practice in documenting everything.
This way, if you have to repair something, you know exactly what your settings are. No experimenting. Okay.
Yep.
Anyone else? Well, I guess we can call it a night then. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.